Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Doctora Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome to the final episode of Season 1 of ¿Qué Pasa? HSIs, a podcast where we talk about all things HSIs and where we have the chance to learn about the latest research, scholarship, knowledge, and best practices coming out of HSIs and the people dedicated to advancing servingness. When I dreamt up the idea of a podcast dedicated exclusively to HSIs, I envisioned a show that would complicate an understanding of servingness, a place where I could talk to my friends and colegas about and co-conspirators in the HSI struggle about all the intricacies of servingness, while acknowledging that HSIs have not arrived as a unique and distinct group of colleges and universities, and HSIs have not yet become spaces of justice and liberation for Latinx, Latine, and other minoritized students. Yet we still are here doing the hard work to get there. The first season of the podcast has been all that and more. After every episode we would record, AC and I would chat for a few minutes about how mind-blown we were with each episode. I personally and professionally knew a majority of our guests before each show, but was truly blown away by the knowledge shared. Our guests poured into us, sharing their research and scholarship and talking about their ideas for advancing servingness in practice. And they did this con cariño, with much love and appreciation for me as their host, for you as their listeners, for HSIs as a whole, and for the Latinx and Latine students they are so committed to serving. It's been an honor launching ¿Qué Pasa? HSIs. In today's episode, I talked to Doctora Maribel Jiménez, who serves as the Dean of Academic Transfer Pathways and Partnerships at Highline College in Washington. Doctora Jiménez was a must for me on the show, as her research with HSIs touches an area that is underdeveloped in HSI scholarship: strategic planning. The strategic planning process is one of the most significant processes that all higher ed institutions engage in, yet HSIs often do not think about or even mention their HSI work, plans, goals, objectives, or outcomes in their strategic plans. Maribel centers HSIs in her conversations about strategic planning while acknowledging that the process is mostly race neutral and dominated by white ways of practicing higher ed. She shares insight into making this process about Latinx students and HSIs, guided by the findings from her dissertation. Doctora Jiménez has a Doctor of Education from North Central University, a Master of Social Work from Eastern Washington University, a Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice from Eastern Washington University, and Associate of Arts from Yakima Valley College. As a practitioner and alumna of an HSI, Yakima Valley, she brings her personal experiences and journey into her praxis, and as she implements servingness. She has 15 years of experience forging partnerships across sectors and with surrounding communities with equitable transfer in mind, and is a forward-thinking professional who coordinates work to serve students across the institution and across sectors with budget and expectations. Her background in social work, counseling, culturally responsive pedagogy, and equity-minded frameworks comes through in all the work that she does with HSIs. I first met Doctora Jiménez at the Alliance of Hispanic Serving Institution Educators Conference a few years back, and through our mutual friend, Dr. Melissa Salazar, who is the founder of Escala Educational Services. I'll go ahead and plug, there will be an episode with these two amazing doctoras and talking about Escala in season 2. Doctora Jiménez's energy is so positive and so caring, I couldn't help but be drawn to her. I now have the honor of supporting her as she works to bring her dissertation findings to the masses through scholarly publication, because as I keep telling her, we need this work. I learned so much from Doctora Jiménez during this episode and hope you do too. Have fun and enjoy the show. All righty, let's go ahead and get started with today's episode. Today we have Dr. Jiménez. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here today on ¿Qué Pasa? HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But before we talk about what's up, with HSIs, we like to talk about you and hear a little bit about you and your higher education journey. So let's start there with how, tell us a little bit about how you have gone through higher ed from beginning to where you are now.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to say mil gracias for inviting me here today to talk to you, Dr. Garcia. It's an honor to be here and to be invited. I grew up in a little town, Mabton, Washington, which is in the Yakima Valley in Washington State. My parents and my little family moved to Washington when I was like 6. And so my K through 12 experience was very much, everybody looked like me. I think we'll talk about this later, but the fact that a lot of people don't really know that there's a like very large Latinx community in Washington, especially in the Yakima Valley, where you have a lot of agriculture work and farm workers, and there's a whole history there about the Bracero program and all that. We won't go, we can talk more about that another time, but yeah, so my family migrated to Washington, after the field work, and then we just kind of settled here in Washington, and so for the most part in K-12, my graduating class was like 55 people, and everybody was brown. They looked like me. But all of our teachers were white. And so it was very early on that about freshman year, I'm an upward bound student. So I was in trio for, high school and then in college. And it was through trio that I learned about college and things like that. So it wasn't because, my high school counselor or my teachers or anybody said, hey, you should probably go to college. That was never anything that happened, but it was when I started to notice, like, oh, well, how come she's only talking to these students, and why don't I get to hear about college? And when the colleges were coming on the visits, right, the recruiters and things like that. And so that was when I started just being a part of Upward Bound, that they would take us to the university campuses to do events, to do things like that. And I think it's important also to mention that I'm like second oldest. And so my older brother, who's like 2 years older than me, he was in Upward Bound. But it was more like the chiripada, because he wasn't supposed to be, but because they needed more kids from our school, they put him in. And so it wasn't really like because he needed it. And then it was because he had done that my dad was like, okay, well, he did it, then I guess you can do it too. Because, I grew up in a very traditional Mexican family home where I can't do it. Like, I wasn't allowed to do sports or anything like that, from my house from the school to my house, and that's it. And then, make dinner and I did all of that. And it was I was responsible for a lot of the home, right? Because my mom worked. And so there's that's a whole other conversation about how like our just identities of being part of a traditional Mexican home, kind of just how that interacts with our work too, because I think it matters. And that's why I mentioned it. But it was because of a girl in Upward Bound, and she's the one that told me about Running Start, which is a program where you can start college while you're in high school. So it wasn't my teachers, it wasn't the system, right? It was like, just like, hey, she just kind of like, she was older than me. It was like, you should probably think about this because you're kind of smart and you should, maybe try that. And so then I asked about it because she had told me about it. So then I ended up getting into Running Start and finishing my AA degree, my transfer degree, when I graduated from high school. And but it was all through like Upward Bound, and that was at Yakima Valley College, where Mabton is very close to. I went to the Grandview campus, which was the small satellite campus that was near my hometown. And so that was my initial kind of like connection to Yakima Valley College, and then I'll come like full circle, right, to then being a faculty member there years later. But then after I graduated, I went to Eastern Washington University, which you mentioned earlier. The thing I want to mention about Eastern Washington University, it was the first time that I saw people that looked different than me. So I had like major culture shock. And I also, when I got there at 18 years old, I had just graduated from high school, but I also had my 2-year degree. They were like, you have to declare your major. And I didn't know what that meant. And the reason I say this is because I feel like that is what happens to our students, right? Like we just make assumptions that they know what all of these things mean, and we don't know. And so then this was the first time that I saw somebody that looked like me. So when I went to talk to the chair of the criminal justice department and the psychology department, because I knew I wanted to do like one of those two things, I wasn't really sure. And then it was the chair of the criminal justice department that was Mexicana, and she looked like me, which is what guided me towards that field, right? And I say that because I feel like that's like it shows the importance and the power that the institutional people have on students, especially if you don't know what you don't know, right? And so I feel like so I declared criminal justice, and during my program, when I realized like I am in the wrong program. You know, there was people in my classes who were like, oh, I just want to be a sheriff so I could like have a gun, and you know, and I was like, this is not what I'm trying to be or do. Like it was just like completely opposite of what I knew my values were and what I wanted to do. And outside of that, though, I was involved in Mecha, which I imagine you're familiar with, is the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, and that has a huge historical implication for Latinx students. And for those folks who don't know what that is, I encourage them to look at the history of that movement. You know, how it has paved the way basically, and we don't really talk about it as much as I think we should. And so outside of that, our mission for Mecha, first of all, I found community, right? And it was not because of the institution, but in spite of the institution, we found community, and I continue to be, those are my lifelong friends still to this day that we connected through Mecha outside of the classroom, right? And I just, you know, we continually now, you know, 20 years later, reflect on like, I don't even know how we made it through, like knowing what I know now about systems and education, like how did we even graduate, you know? But I remember we would just be like, I don't have food, but I have this, you know, I have tomates. What do you have? Oh, pues I have this. Well, okay, can we make a dinner? Like between all of us, we would take care of each other, feed each other, take care of each other in all of the ways that I don't think that we give our students credit for. You know, they take care of themselves, even when the institution doesn't.
Yep.
And so, so through that, I was part of the Mecha mission for Eastern when I was there. Was we would go to the high schools to talk to students in the Yakima Valley, and we would talk about, you know, just like, you know, what we did and how we got to college, and that we felt that was the kind of like, that's what we made our mission to be, because, you know, all the Mechas have different missions, what they do. And, well, 1 year later, my final year in the criminal justice department, we hosted the regional Mecha conference at Eastern, and I was part of the planning committee that did that. And one of the students that I had gone to in high school the year before was like, Maribel, I came to Eastern because of you, because of what you told me, you know? And it was in that moment that I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Like, I want to be able to talk to students about college and the opportunities that they have. So instead of switching majors, my advisors were like, no, just get your master's in counseling or something like that, right? And so then I ended up getting my, but I decided to go with social work just because I felt like that would give me like a better opportunity to do more things if I needed to. So I did my MSW program there at Eastern 2. And then right after that, I went straight into counseling in K-12. So I did K-12 counseling and actually in Oregon, where there's another large community of Mexicanos, which is in like the Umatilla area, which is right by the Columbia River, where because there's a lot of like, you think about Washington, Yakima Valley, and that's like all field work, but then in Oregon, it's a lot of like factories, right? Like you have Lamb Weston, like these national like companies that send like onions and different crops, and they kind of manufacture them there, and that's where all the gente are, right? Like, and that's where I was. And so it was there when I was at the high school there that I worked with, still a small town. I worked in Boardman, Oregon, which was in Riverside High School in the Morrow County School District. And all of the Mexicanos were there, and they were my students in the high school. And a lot of them we didn't realize until it was time to get them to go to college that they were undocumented. And so then there was this so that's where my passion grew for helping undocumented students. And so then when I finally moved back to Washington, I moved back, because I also miss my family. And then I had an opportunity to move back to work in Toppenish, which is another little town in the Yakima Valley. And then I was there at the elementary school for like a year. And that's when I applied to be like a faculty counselor at Yakima Valley College, which is 70% Latinx students. And same in that Yakima Valley. So then that brings me to Yakima Valley College, where I was brought in as a faculty counselor. And that's where I soon began to understand, like what's happening here? Like, why aren't we graduating students like this? And then we had the highest. And then I started, like, the cool thing about Washington State is that, like, unlike any other state, is that all the community colleges are part of a state board, and we're connected. Like, all the parts of the college are connected. So there's 34 community and technical colleges in the state of Washington, and we have like all like councils and commissions and just like groups that are connected. So once a quarter, like all the financial aid directors meet, like every quarter, to see like what's going on at your college, And so when I started working at Yakima Valley College, they asked me to be the Yakima Valley College representative on the Multicultural Student Services Directors Council, which is all of the 34 community and technical colleges have multicultural centers, or, like people that were working with students of color, basically. And YVC didn't have one. So it was like, they just were like, hey, we need somebody to represent us on this council. You're hired. Do you want to do this? And I did. And so then that's when I was connected with 34 other people that had like similar passions about working with students of color. And we basically did a lot of work statewide around undocumented students. And this was around 2014 when Washington State passed some laws that allowed undocumented students to apply for the Washington State Need Grant. So they had access to financial aid, and that was in 2014, and it was around that time. So a lot of my work was around like just training frontline staff about what does it mean now that there's this law that allows undocumented students to, have access to financial aid to go to college. And so it was at YVC that I started to notice like that my voice wasn't being heard in the ways that I felt were important. And one of the ways that I felt that I needed was to get a doctorate, because I was like, okay, well, what is it that I need? And academia is so like, oh, well, what's your degree? So I know if I should like listen to you or not.
Yes.
And so then that's kind of what brought me to get to my doctorate in organizational leadership and education. So that's kind of like a lot. So I just gave you like full circle. And then there's a lot more. I mean, I have such a big story, because now I'm no longer at Yakima Valley College, because I got pushed out by the administration. Basically, I was there for like 8-9 years trying to say, like, what are we doing for Latinx students? Why aren't we doing this? Like, what's happening? And then and I got pushed out, and you know, now I work at a different institution, who is an emerging HSI. We're at 19%.
Right.
And is really looking at trying to see how we become an HSI. So,
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's a beautiful story, and I appreciate learning so much more about you. I feel connected to you in so many ways. I think many of us have similar stories, similar threads, right? Like I could think of things like, yes, same, right? But then also differences, right? We obviously all have different journeys. I was the exact opposite. I came from a very white, city, and then went to an HSI, right? And for the first time was around Latino students, but we had to find our place too. Even with a lot, right? Even with not a lot, but an HSI, right? We at the time were emerging. So, but still a good 20 to 25% Latinx students. But yeah, you know, like the journey is so important of how we got and where our passion comes from. And I think that's what we're going to get throughout this conversation is you're very passionate about this work. And clearly it's very much connected to your own journey. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to keep going down that path a little bit, but we're going to turn it to servingness. And I want to hear, because you just started to get into HSI, and I want to know a little bit more about that. Is how did your servingness journey, or how did HSI come into your consciousness, right?
Yeah. And I really love it, especially because I was thinking about like, how did I learn? Because that seems like so long ago, right? But when I first started working at Yakima Valley College, which has been an HSI since like 2001, I didn't know that it was, or what that meant or anything like that. When I first started working there, I had no idea. And it wasn't until knowing when I started getting involved with grant work, and I just knew it was grant work, but I wasn't really sure like what. And so now I know what I didn't know then is that like Yakima Valley College has always had grants because of our, you know, we have really like 70% of our student body identifies as Latinx, and you know, more than like 80% of our students are low income, you know, and 80% are first generation. So there's a lot of just being the demographics that we have makes us very like, okay, like all the grants, you know, we qualify for them all, right? And so YFC has always had grants. And so it wasn't until I was getting involved with that work through like the director, who was always looking for people to like do some work that was written into the grant. And I slowly but surely and quickly started like getting into that. And it wasn't until I was trying to remember if it was 2016 or 2017 when ASI was in Las Vegas. And that was the first year that I went. And I was actually, and I think I've told you this, that it was a workshop that you were doing on, and I just happened, at the time, I was like, I didn't know who you were at the time. I didn't know your scholarship, you know, I didn't know you were like the reina of HSIs, you know, I didn't know that. And so I happened to just read the description, and I remember going, and I remember we were in this like lecture hall, and we were like up on like these like chairs, you know, you were down there and you were talking about this like place that didn't exist, and that it was your dream of like what an HSI looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember was like, yes, oh my goodness, yes. Like, and then I asked you, you probably don't remember, but I said, well, is there a college that is already doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And you were like, well, no. No, this is where we want to be, and that was my initial introduction to what it could look like and what it could look like. And it gave me that permission to like, oh, it doesn't have to look like this. Like it could look different. And I think that's when I started to read more of like the scholarship and then got more connected in understanding why we had grants and what the purpose of that was and how are we really serving our Latinx student population at Yakima Valley College. And so I think that's where I came into it. And then it was just a continual like, okay, what did we write in this grant? What is happening as we write the next grant? What do we want to do? But I was not the leader of that. There was like there was other people, and I imagine that this happens in a lot of institutions where people are just like I was doing direct student service, so I always felt like I had like all of the ways that we could do things differently, but nobody like asked me. Nobody said, hey, Maribel, what do you think? Even though that just amongst my team, we talked about it all the time. Like, why do we do this like this? Why are we making barriers? Like, this is another barrier to access. And it wasn't until like, I just like, I think one of my like core values is like, even if my voice is shaky, like I have to say something, even if I'm going to get in trouble or like, maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but I'm going to say it. Right. And so slowly but surely, I started getting more and more involved in that work at YVC. And then that's when like the leadership or like the grant leadership started to pull me in more and more. And then by the end of my time at YVC, we had gotten a new Title V grant, and then I was written in as the director. And so it was kind of like, it took like, maybe, I don't know, 5 years. And of just like trying to figure out like, if this isn't benefiting, our Latinx student population, why are we doing it? And why are we using these funds that we were given for Latinx students, but now we're like going to serve all students. And then what's interesting about that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I'm talking about my research, but it's like when you live in a place, like if you think of the Washington State HSIs, there's only, when you say all students, it's like Latinos and white students, right? Because that's who you have. It's like two different populations, right? And so then what happens is, so when you're saying all students is because you want to continue to center whiteness, because you want to make white students comfortable, or white people or white folks who work at the college. So it's not like, at universities or HSIs who have like large students of like a lot of different identities. It's more like in Washington, it's basically one or the other. Right. So 70% are Latinx and 30% are white. And so all students means different things in different institutions. And that's why I think for me, my perspective comes from that, because that's what I experienced. So when I say decentering, it's because you're like still centering whiteness, because you say all students. And what does that mean? If you take away the Latinx student, who do you have left? Right. And so anyway, I wanted to throw that in there because that's going to be important when I talk about my research.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, you're just giving me all these chills. You're like my hermana de alma, like we're soul sisters, right? Like we definitely like have so many similar, like I've been that same exact person. I don't know if you know, but I also was, implementing a Title V grant long back in the days before I started dreaming. And I would just, those same feelings of like, I don't think this is right. This doesn't feel right. this doesn't feel right at all. This feels like an all lives matter sort of approach. I don't know what an HSI is, so I don't have much to say because it was pre, any of my own scholarship, or a lot of scholarship really, on HSI. So, it's frustrating when you're like trying to do good work and you can see different, right? And I think that's where the dreaming, right? Where I say, I'm just dreaming. I totally remember that. It was Decolonizing HSIs part 2.
Yeah. Right.
Right. That was part 2 because I think I had done it one time before. Maybe that was part 1 and then I did it again, but I did that presentation twice, right? For our SC. It might have been the first time actually. And people were like blown away, right? Because it was like, wow, you can dream, you could color outside the box. Right. That was the feeling I got from that SC presentation, right? That it was like, we're allowed to do things differently, but they haven't let us, right? Because the federal government says these things. And all of a sudden, here I am, just wildly off the wall, saying all kind of like, why not, right? Why can't we do better? Why can't we do different? So, so I love that you told that story, right, about how we even came into each other's worlds, right? Because it's true. It's like a lot of us are doing this work, just trying to dream of a better future, because we can do better by our students. So, and I know that's what you're doing on the ground and in your practice and in your research. So let's talk a little bit about the research, which I want to know more about, because you talked about an area that nobody's talking about. Well, not nobody. There's a few folks, but it's an under-researched area, which is strategic planning, right? Like nerdy higher ed things. Like, strategic planning. In higher ed, but then centering HSIs in that work. So talk to us a little bit about your dissertation, and what you did, the approach you took, and what some of the things you found, right? Some of the things that we can learn from.
And before I get into my research, I want to share a little bit about how I came to that to be my topic, because I think it's like where a lot of people, I think a lot of people, especially practitioners, could relate, is that because initially, that was not my topic. Initially, I was gonna really focus on white faculty and understanding why some of them are willing to do some of this work and some are not. And I wanted to and I still, have interest in that. But initially, when I first started my doctoral process journey, I thought that was going to be my topic, right? Because I was noticing that I'm like, wow, these faculty are really involved, and really want to do this work. There's a lot of them, but there's a lot of them who don't. And so what's the difference? Like, why do they do it and they don't, So I wanted to focus there. But what I found was that that meant taking like a really deep dive into whiteness in higher ed. And it was like really affecting my well-being as as a practitioner, as a person, and I was like, I can't do this. If this journey is so long, I cannot do this. So that's for practitioners who are thinking about, doing the doctoral journey. I want to just say, do it, but it's, you got to be really intentional about what you're going to study, because you are going to be living and breathing it for a long time. And so during that same time, I was also, again, the chiripada, not because they sought me out, not because they were like, oh, Maribel, you probably have, something to share here, but it was time to write the strategic plan, the new strategic plan for YVC. And I was just, I feel like the leadership has a responsibility to invite people to be part of the process. And so I think at that point, the president was like, hey, you should, anyone who, at convocation where all the faculty come in are like, oh, anyone who wants to do it, come be part of it, right? And usually that means nobody does. But I did. I was like, if this is a for real, invitation, I'm going to take it, because maybe it'll, maybe I can have, put voice to what, I'm experiencing through my students, of what they're experiencing, of what, where we need to go. And so I just sent an email, was like, hey, you said that we could, join if we wanted to. So I'd like to join. And so then so sure enough, they were like, okay. So they put me a part of this team of 4. that were going to start thinking through like what this new strategic plan was going to look like. And so we were discussing like granted at this point, I know like other than, it's a document that's going to guide your work. I don't really know much of it. I just know like if there's an opportunity, I should take this right now. So then what happened was that they started, and I don't want to mention the organization, but there's a national organization that goes around, to colleges to help them write strategic plans, right? So they were like, we're going to hire them. And so they bring these people and we have the initial conversations with them. But then I'm like, well, what do you know about HSIs? Because that's different, right? Like you can't just come in and say, I'm going to help you write the strategic plan, but you have no idea about what it means to have like, a large Latinx student population. How do you not even acknowledge that when you're trying to help us write the strategic plan and help us do what we need to do, right? So I just was really just like disappointed and just like I couldn't, like almost in shock. Like, how do you bring in these people who don't even know us, don't know our college, don't know what it means to be an HSI or an MSI? I even asked them, like, what about MSI? Do you work with MSIs? And they had like no idea what I was talking about. And then I was like, I can't imagine that you're going to spend money to help, and they pay tons and tons of money to these organizations, consultants to come and help. And I just was like, no. So then that's when I decided to switch my topic of like, well, I'm going to become an expert in strategic planning, specifically in HSIs. And that's kind of how I came to the topic, because one, it was like more, it's more aligned with what I'm passionate about, and I can do it more because I think that there's like, what I learned was that, it matters. The leadership matters. It matters where the vision, the direction of where the college is going matters. It really informs the work of the institution. And so I learned so much about the importance of strategic plans and how they can be leveraged to really to transform an institution. And so that's kind of how I came to it. And then that's, the rest is kind of like what I'm going to talk about, right? Is my dissertation question and things like that.
Although I hope to hear that you are launching your own consulting firm for HSI soon. Okay. That's the
yeah,
next
I don't know
podcast.
we're there yet, but yeah.
But eventually,
Right.
What a great story. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Research. Tell us.
So research. Yeah. So then what I did was that I wanted to really understand how the strategic plans were, how HSIs were connecting their identity, their like priorities and initiatives in their strategic plan to center the experience of Latinx students, as you would think, HSI would do. And so I went looking for that research, and there was only one study that I could find. And it was Flores and Leal out of Texas. And I contacted them. And so we had like a meeting, and I think I contacted you too. And I'll say why I contacted you. We had a meeting. But I talked to them, and they had a study where they looked at 19 strategic plans in Texas. And they looked at how many of them are really like centering their Latinx students, because the colleges they looked at were like colleges like YBC that have a very high percentage of Latinx students, and they came up with like 3 categories of like of Latinx ghosting, Latinx serving, and so I can't remember the third one, but I think we can probably like put it in the resources or something. I have the article.
Yes.
And so what they found was that most colleges are not connecting their strategic plan at all to serving and centering the experiences of Latinx students. And so I thought, okay, well, there's not a lot of research on that. So then what they recommended was like talk to the actual people that are doing it about why, because they just did like a content analysis, right? They didn't talk to me. They just looked at all the strategic plans and compared them and analyzed them. So then I thought, okay, well, I want to talk to the people that actually created the plan to see like, what are they thinking? What are their experiences? What are their stories and perceptions about how do you develop a strategic plan that centers Latinx students? And so that's what I did. So I basically recruited, I did a narrative inquiry, which allows the researcher, me, to really understand the experiences of a phenomenon that really hasn't been explored, and it really hasn't. And so the study, what I found was in the, actually I used your framework is grounded in the structures for serving component of the multidimensional conceptual framework of understanding servingness and HSIs, which is, Dr. Garcia, Nunez, and Sansonde. The three of you, created this, and I talk a lot about how it was created, the framework, right, and how the research is grounded in that, and the recommendation by you and them was like, like take one of the pieces and study it, and that's basically what I did, and so then in the structures for serving part of the framework, I was like, where do I find strategic planning? And then that's when you said, I think we talked initially during that time, and you're like, well, there's no research because the framework was created through a synthesis of the research that's already out there of HSIs. And because there's no research around strategic planning, but this is where it would fall under, structures for serving, right? Because that's where the structures for serving shape the institutional capacity to really intentionally serve the Latinx students. And so that's what I focused on. And so I used that part of the framework to really talk to these to the 8 participants. And so I found an HSI in Washington Community College, and it's not YVC. So it's a different one. So people might be like, oh, well, has to be that one.
Of course,
no,
of course.
Yeah, no, it was not. It was a different one. And it was really cool because it just all happened to be that they were literally in that moment engaged in strategic planning. Mm-hmm. And so there was 16 people on their team, and I sent my, recruitment email to all of them, and I got like 8 people to respond. And it was from executive cabinet to like frontline staff. Right. So I had a variety of people that in those 8 people that participated. And so really, I asked them questions around, strategic planning. And I had 5 guiding questions, which were around like, what does servingness mean to you? Like, because I still wanted to know, like, what is their idea of servingness and how are they incorporating that into the strategic plan? And what I found, so I ended up doing narrative interviews, and I interviewed them both twice and asked them about their experiences. And really what I found was that I ended up with 13 themes. I had 5 research questions, which is way too many now that I know.
Wow.
I know.
Would never allow that.
I know, but my chair wasn't like, hey, you should probably have 2 or 1 or 3,
yeah, 1.
I had 5.
say 1.
Yeah, so I had 5 research questions, and each of them had 2 themes that answered them. And then except the one about challenges to servingness, incorporating servingness into the strategic plan, had 5, the challenges. And so I think that, I could go on and on about all of my 13 themes, but I think that I want to really focus on the things that I found were, that there's a couple of challenges, and one is, lack of time and capacity for the people, because I think people are really moving towards like including in this shared governance where we're going to include all these people. But the problem is that you don't prepare them. You don't tell them what they're going to do. They don't, like, all of them were like, I don't even know what strategic planning is or what the purpose is. And I definitely don't know anything about HSI-ness and servingness. And so I feel like what I found was that, and they're not being like, because you're going to do this work, we're going to take this off of your plate. So it was like, here's my job. And on top of that, I have to go to all these meetings to create a strategic plan. And so then people feel really taxed and really like their work is like not really valued. But then you have to have that internal conflict of like, but I really want to contribute to this, but I can't because, so I have to do that and I have to do my job. So there's this really like this conflict of like, well, how do I say no? But then my voice doesn't get included. And that's really unfortunate that we can't figure out ways in which I tell people how to do it at the end, I came up with 6 steps to incorporating servingness in strategic planning at HSIs. And people will have to wait for the published article for that. But
I was going to say, can you tell us or we got to wait?
Well, Dr. Garcia is helping me trying to figure out how to publish my work because that's another thing they don't tell you about when you're in doctor school. They don't say like, hey, you should probably know how to do this because we don't. But so I'll say this. So there's essential elements. Let me see. The strategic planning is for a couple of things. So it ensures institutional effectiveness. It helps articulate the mission. It evaluates the efficiency and effectiveness of the strategic goals. And it includes optimal alignment of initiatives. It clearly articulates the future direction and it's used for meaningful decision making. So that's how I'm defining strategic planning. And the reason I say that is because if your mission doesn't even include your HSI designation or something about serving your Latinx students, then how can you, so like your strategic plan should be like a mission fulfillment report. Mm-hmm. So how do you fulfill your mission? What is your mission of the college? And if it doesn't include the HSI designation, then it's really going to skew what's in it, and people aren't really sure about what their work is and how to connect to it, right? And so actually at Yakima Valley, we did like our mission statement. That was one of the things that I helped with before we left, is to include our HSI designation in the new mission of the college. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like the challenges, there are lack of time and capacity, meaningful metrics. And what I mean by that is that people don't know, like the data literacy, it has to be there. If you're going to be on the strategic planning team, you have to understand data and how to read it and how to understand it. And that was lacking. Mm-hmm. And then people didn't know how to connect it to their daily work. So even though I'm on the planning team, I don't know how what's written in the strategic plan connects to my daily work. Right. And then the other challenge was white supremacy, and I talk about in my dissertation how that's part of the framework. You have white supremacy up here in the corner of the framework, and that came up as that aligned with the research, right? Is that white supremacy continues to be a challenge to aligning the strategic plan with serving Latinx students, because the discomfort with centering Latinx students and like, it's always coming through like this deficit lens of like, and you talk a lot about that in the framework too, right? Is to talk about like, you have to be careful that you're not speaking about your students through a deficit lens. And then the other, big challenges, again, like the lack of PD, of understanding what strategic planning is in general. And then just like the history of HSI-ness and what does that mean? And do you know where it came from? And do you understand, like, have you read a article from Gina, about like servingness?
At least one. I mean,
at least one. I mean,
there's a
so
lot.
Many. Yeah. And so they ended up telling that was a finding because they're the ones who were saying like, yeah, we don't, because of the questions that I was asking them, they were like, wow, I didn't realize I couldn't answer that because I don't know anything about servingness, or I don't know what it means to be an HSI, which is interesting because this college has been an HSI for a really long time, but they're just starting to talk about what it means to be an HSI. And so I feel like that definitely was an implication for HSI leaders, like practitioners who are like trying to put teams together. It's a disservice to not prepare them to really write a plan that's going to do what it needs to do, which is to center the experiences and ways of being and knowing our Latinx students. And they didn't know how to do that because it was really uncomfortable. And the other finding I got was the decentering. There was a lot of decentering. So there was a specific question that I asked about, like, well, how does the strategic plan center the experiences of Latinx students? And a lot of the participants would then transition to a different student population. They would tell me about anything else but how they are centering Latinx students. And I had to bring them back. And they're like, well, we can't say that. And I'm like, well, why? Why can't you say that? Oh, well, people would be uncomfortable. And so it's like, if we're not having those conversations and making space for people to have those conversations about why we can't center the experience of our Latinx students, then what are we doing? Like, that is essential. Like, if you're not doing that before you go into a strategic planning, mode, there has to be a way to have those conversations that lead into what are we going to do about it. And it could be that maybe that's part of the strategic plan, is that you're going to, in the next 3 years, depending on how far out you're going to write it for, excuse me, then part of it is to, how are we going to make space to have those conversations about centering the experience of our Latinx students? And write it out. Like, that's going to be part of the plan, right? And that's how you build. And because I think what I found is that a lot of people think that they have to get to this really big, create these big, massive changes. But what's happening is that, like, the small, that could be the plan, is to make space, to create, to have conversations. So there's a common collective understanding campus wide about what does it mean to have an HSI identity? How do we want it to be? Like, how does each area of the college define being an HSI? And what does that mean to my part of the work, part of the, to my daily work? And what's happening is that, we're having these really big, lofty goals that, those are not necessary if you're making the small changes as you go, because then the next 3 years, now you've already gotten a common language, right? In these first 3 years, you're building, right? You think of it as building. Wherever you are is wherever you are, and that's fine. But build from there. Like, how can you build? Like, imagine and dream. Let them dream, because I think it's different. It's different for every college, what it means, servingness means. And I think that's what you've been, I feel like that's kind of like the voice that I've been hearing from you, is that, depending on the college, because there's so many, external factors that you might, the way that this Washington schools identify as servingness could be different than in California, right? And so just like, what does it mean for you and your college? But if you're not even making space for people to have that conversation, which is the people who actually work with your students and including your students in those conversations, then you're not going to know what servingness means. And you can't take, what this college in California is doing and bring it to Washington, because it's totally different. Right. And you have to just create the space to have those conversations with all of those stakeholders.
Right.
That's a lot, but
I know. I'm like, whoo.
I can go on and on, but there's a lot. I mean, it was a lot. It was interesting. And I do have some implications for HSI leaders navigating, embracing the HSI designation. Because I think the question that was coming next, I don't know if you want to ask it, is like,
what do practitioners take from your or learn with you? I don't like to say take, it's like taking your knowledge, right? Like, learn from your knowledge, right? Like so everything you've identified is things I've talked about, but I don't think I have a good answer for how to not do those things, right? Like, how to move forward. And I think that's where we're at, is like, we got to give people tools, right? Practitioners need tools, because they're probably listening right now and saying, yes. I say that all the time. Maribel keeps speaking on it, right? but how do I,
But how do I do that?
how do I
Right.
do it? That's
Yeah.
what people ask me all the time is how do I do it? So, and I don't know, maybe that's going to come. I mean, if you want to write a book, I think I have a publisher for you, right? Like you are writing about something that's really, really important.
Right. Right.
I'm not joking about the consulting thing. Like
Yeah.
HSIs should lean on you that has that more centering of Latinx students in your, you know, in your knowledge and in your
Mhm.
practice. But yeah, if you want to tell us one or two things, what the people that are listening, they're like,
Yeah.
what do I do? What do I do?
Yeah. Well, I think that the first and foremost, I think where we're moving to is that you need, like, when we keep saying, oh, it's the institution, who is the institution? We are. And so I think the first thing to look at is yourself. And if you like what another finding is that, and that this comes from the research, the emerging research on leadership in higher ed is that there's a huge lack of knowledge, skills, and abilities from the executive leaders to actually create or develop or do this transformation, organizational transformation that is needed. And the reason for that is because they do not have the knowledge of the racialized experiences of their students of color, especially Latinx students. And so if leaders of HSIs are not willing to do their own work on themselves and how they understand the racialized experiences of their Latinx students, then they are not, you're not going to be able to do this work, and you're not going to be able to create space that is needed, like, or creating those containers that are needed for people to have the conversation and for people to examine how they continue to perpetuate the systems that continue to create barriers and oppress our Latinx students. And so if you're a leader and you're not doing that, then I would recommend, and here's a practical thing, like find the leader in your college that probably doesn't have positionality, but is right there, like serving students and knows exactly what they need when they need it, but nobody's giving that person voice. That is your job as a leader, to find that person and develop them to be the next leader of your college. And really start building the people that are doing the work, because that's what we do. What we don't do, right? If you're an HSI leader and you're not willing to put in the work to understand the racialized experience of your Latinx students, including understanding yourself, and especially if you identify as a white dominant culture person, then it's really up to you to really do one of two things, like either do the work, and wherever you are, stop and do your own work in order to stop perpetuating. Or how do I develop these other leaders who I know are doing that work and are understanding how, like, the racialized experience of our Latinx students. And that can look like a lot of different things, right? It can look like, can you write them into the next grant? Like kind of what happened with me, like write them into the next grant, or have them be a part of those meetings where you're thinking of what will our next grant be? Because a lot of times it's the grant writer who's writing the grant who doesn't even work directly with students. That's who's writing the grant, and why isn't the people that are frontline staff part of those meetings of like, what is it that our students are saying to you? What are you hearing? Or even revolutionary include students,
Ooh,
in those conversations.
Yeah,
And just how do you, build leaders from the people because I can assure you there's at least 3, depending on how big your college is, 3 to 5 people right now who are really frustrated, who are like me, who were like you, Gina, who are like, we know what needs to be done, but nobody's giving us voice. Nobody is creating space for my voice to be. And I'm not talking about like, oh, do a survey. That's not what I'm talking about, because a lot of times we're like, oh, well, we did a focus group and they didn't show up. You know why they didn't show up? Because they can't leave their desk. Right?
Ooh, yep.
You can't leave there. You're not intentional. And I think all of this is about intentionality. Like, what
Mhm.
are you really trying to do, and who are you talking to, and who has the information that you need? Because it is there. You have it at your college. You don't need consultants.
Yeah.
You have it
No.
at your college.
Oh, yes, yes. That right there was that was a whole word, because it's true. It's almost like you read my book, my next book already, and I'm like, I'm gonna put you on the first list, to the list of first people to send it to. I talk about grassroots leadership in my book, and that's exactly what you're talking about. Is that, like, there are people who aren't the director, they're not the deans, they're not the vice chancellor, they're not the whatever, but they're doing Servingness every day because they are committed to serving this every day, right? They don't get they don't get the grants, they don't get the limelight, they're not on the podcast today with me, right? Like, none of that, but they're doing the work every single day, right? And they don't even, they do it because they are committed to doing the work, right? How do we develop those folks, right? How do we develop those folks within our Servingness work? And I think you're right, like, write them into the next grant, right? Like, bring them in, acknowledge the work that they're doing, because it's often unpaid labor. We know that, right? There's unpaid labor that people of color, women, femmes put on their back and carry it, and carry the institution. And all the institution does at the end is say, yay, look what we did. And it's like, nah, I did that, bro. But like, all right, you can have the limelight for a second, but like, we did that. Right. And it's often we, it's not even I, it's we, because we do it in community all the time. So yeah, I agree. I agree. And I'm applauding your work, and I hope folks are listening and thinking about all this. This is happening across HSIs, right? Exactly what you're talking about. And we've got to do better. Got to do better about figuring this out. So I want to transition a little bit into some of your practice, because you've also done this, you talked a lot about your research, but it was intertwined in also practice, obviously, because it was very much about practice. But you have been an HSI director, you have been written into a grant, and implemented a grant. So talk to us a little bit about that, because I know some folks listening, they're trying to figure out that piece, right? How do we successfully implement and run a 5-year HSI grant? So talk to us a little bit about some of your experiences with successes. Like, what would you say are some things that will lead to success?
Right. And I think that, like, the key thing to that is to look at what are we doing right? What are we already doing that is successful, and then building off of that and supporting that? Because a lot of times these initiatives or projects that were written into the grant, often we want to write something brand new and shiny, but maybe it's about looking at where are things going well, and how do you write a grant that gives that area or activity or initiative more resources. And I don't think that we often think like that. I think we always want to do something new and innovative, but that's how we get caught up in having so many initiatives and so many activities, and that's part of strategic planning too, is like, how do you align all of those things instead of having like 4 or 5 different plans? You have a mission fulfillment plan, you have a strategic plan, you have a diversity plan, you have like like all of these plans, instead of having one plan that includes all of the things that are going well and that are serving students, that are having really great outcomes. How do you scale up, the places that, because this is what I hear all the time, because like, for example, we know Trio works, right? Oh, well, let's scale that up. Well, we don't have the resources for that. We can never do that. Well, why doesn't the next grant talk about how you scale up every student having somebody that's going to be able to work with them on, advising or creating an ed plan or whatever it is that's making that successful, or, creating like, learning communities? Then why not include that in your next grant of how to scale that up, of where we know students are being successful? So that's one. And then the second thing is that when I was a grant director, every time there was a funding request, because when you're like the fairy godmother because you have money, and people want to come talk to you about like, hey, I have this idea, and I always was like, well, how does that benefit Latinx students? And if they can't tell you, articulate how this is going to, any kind, like really, support or expand on the experience of your Latinx students, then I'm not funding it, because that's what the money's for, like to fund, like we want to build educational attainment for our Latinx students. And if you go back to, the Higher Ed Act of 1992, that's what it was about, is like, okay, we're noticing that our Latinx students are not, they're enrolling fine, but what's happening is they're not finishing. So what's happening, obviously something's happening in between that they're not finishing. So what is it that we can put our money and resources towards? And this is where people get stuck with but what about all students? And that's what I was talking about, because then, you're trying to, it's this idea of like raising all ships, right? But this ship already started from the very bottom. So you're still, continuing to like perpetuate the inequity, because you're like serving all students instead of like, how do you focus on your Latinx students to bring them up, up to where, they can, experience their educational journey in a way that's going to be, barrier free, and they can have access to all of the things in all of the ways. And so I think that just being really mindful and intentional about who you're giving your funding to and how is it serving your Latinx students, and asking them that. And if you can't answer that, then no, like we can't fund that. Sorry. And being like really clear about what you're going to fund and what you're not going to fund. And I think involved, like what I did was I had multiple areas for the grant, was around universal design, financial literacy, and expanding our BAS programs. And I did what I said to do just a couple minutes ago, was I made project leads from the people that I put them in those positions because I knew that they knew how to serve the students. And then also they had never had an opportunity. They didn't have positionality. So anytime you as a grant director can give positionality to those folks who are doing the work, that's how you're going to start to build leaders as well, is through your grant work, is how are you putting in, your people that are doing all the work and can really speak to the student experience and how to center it, and how do you give them space and positionality through the grant. And so that's another way. That's like a third thing. And so as far as like, if I want to talk a little bit about being a counselor, and it's like, you talked about that burden that people of color often take, that unpaid, unspoken, your student is your student, and you're going to be who, like, and I kind of think of just being for them, just being, like, whatever it is that they need in that moment, that's what you're going to be for them, whether it's like, the tia, the tío, la comadre, the you need food, whatever, and it's like, there's so many people that are just like, that's not my job. That's not, like, go like that's, and that's not how we work. And if you're gonna, and I think that's part of understanding the students that you serve, is that that's not how we do things. And especially in the Latinx community, we're all about everyone is everything for everyone. Mm-hmm. And until we can get away from these like white supremacy pillars, of how we do things in higher ed, I think it's going to be really difficult to really be a serving institution until you mm-hmm. can realize that, when a student finds a person, that's a person for everything, for financial aid, for like whatever, they're going to come back to you because they've connected with you, which is why in the counseling center, that's another really unique thing at Yakima Valley College, is that we're all most of us are Latinx, and there's like 9 of us, I think, and most of us are. And so, from all the areas of the college, when they assess us, that's who gets, basically that's our multicultural center, because we had mm-hmm. food, we had, resources, we had everything to wrap around the student. And, mm-hmm. but that shouldn't be just in one center, that should be everywhere. Wherever mm-hmm. they go, they should have that same service. And how do we get there? And that's the question, right? And how do you put that into your strategic plan, that's what you're going to be? But then it goes even one step back, in that people are like, why would we do that? Why that, we can't do that. We can't be that for our students. And I've had people tell me that, that's not our job to feed our students. and I've heard that from leadership. And
Yeah.
so that's what I mean, that leadership matters. It matters who your leaders are. It matters what they're doing and what work they're doing with themselves and how to understand the racialized experience of our students.
Absolutely. What I hear you saying is like servingness is going to happen regardless, right? That what you just described is like, I see that often, right? When I'm working with institutions, it's like, there's like pockets of servingness already happening, whether you have a grant, whether you have a designation, whether you have a seal, it don't matter. This is going to happen anyways, because the people in that space are committed to serving students, right?
Right.
Through their lens, through their cultural, framing. Food matters to students. I talked to a student on a panel recently, and she said, this was so powerful. Like, I will not forget this. She said, I used to stay on campus as long as I had food. So we want to measure engagement by these white normative measures of engagement and say, well, students aren't engaged, Latino students and low income students and first gen students aren't engaged. Well, yeah, they have to think about other things. Like literally, she was like, if my food ran out, I had to go home. Engagement done, right? Like engagement's done. If it's 3 p.m. and there's a lot of things to go on all the way on campus till 9 p.m. that are engagement, it's not happening because I need to go home. Right. Like basic needs. So yeah, absolutely. Providing students with basic needs is important, right? And is servingness. But like for leaders not to understand that, that's like, that seems so basic. It seems so like, come on, right? Like basic needs is easy enough to get, but it's not. People are missing that. Yes. And it's unfortunate. So thank you for telling us a little bit about that. I think I want to ask you a question about Washington. Okay. Because you've been doing this work in Washington, and I don't think I have any other guests who've ever done servingness in Washington. I've never done research in Washington. I've only visited 2 HSIs in Washington. Yakima Valley College was one of them. And so what's unique about doing servingness in the state of Washington? And think about even like larger structures, like you named state boards, policies, state policies, those kind of things. How do all those things that go on in Washington specifically, how is it make servingness and doing HSI work unique?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of it, first of all, is that binary that I spoke of earlier, is that when you look at, I think there's like 6 HSIs in Washington, and there's a couple of emerging HSIs, and I think it's only going to grow, right? And then people are like, okay, how do we become HSIs? But I think that in my experience, so the interesting part is that we're all basically in central or eastern part of the state, central to central, east central, or however you say that, it is where we are, right? And they're mostly rural. And then there's that binary that mostly it's either Latinx or white students, like that's the populations. And whether it's universities, there's a couple universities, and for the most part, we're community colleges. But we are all connected. And I think that the rurality of it, and I know that there's some like there's research around being a rural HSI that's emerging as well. But it really is about like, well, there's really nowhere else to go. Like in the Yakima Valley, there's not another community college. Like you're going to go to Yakima Valley College, And so when other colleges, like the one that I'm at now, is struggling with enrollment, YVC, well, there's really there's nobody competing, right? Because it's very rural. And what we know about our Latino community, Latinx community, is that we're going to stay close to home and we're going to stay where our family is. And that's why the college hardly ever struggles with enrollment. And that's what I think is the same for a lot of the HSIs in Washington State. And I think that I don't know that the Washington State HSIs are often included in the national conversations about HSIs, and I think they should be, because they are different. We have a large undocumented student population, and so a lot of our HSI work includes work like, how do we help our undocumented students have access to education, and all of the creative and out of the box thinking that needs to go around that. And I think that all of the HSIs struggle with that, because we also, being Eastern and Central part of Washington, is that it's very like a conservative, racist area. So like I said, the population outside of the HSI as well is 50-50, right? It's either like white folks and then there's these, and mostly Mexicanos. You hear about Latinx, but they don't identify as Latinx. They're Mexicanos. And specifically from Michoacán, Mexico. So it's very targeted, like very specific population of Latinx students, what we call Latinx, but I don't think they would identify as that. And so I think those are the uniquenesses of about the Washington State colleges in kind of like in a nutshell. I don't know if you had more questions about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think you've touched on a lot of important things because regions matter, right? And even if you just talk about the kind of Latinx, right, matters, right? Mexicanos, right? If that's specific, right? That's very different than if you're like in the Northeast or the Southeast in Florida, right? Like there's different, and that affects Servingness, right? And how we're going to approach the work. So it does matter. So thank you for that. So the final question is always a fun question, but also it stumps people for some reason. I don't know. It seems like the easiest question to me. People show up because they want to know what's happening with HSI. So how do you summarize in a quick response, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
Okay, I think that I would summarize with saying that leadership matters. I think that the leadership informs the direction of the HSI, and if there's not a lot of work happening with themselves and how they're showing up to the college and how they're positioned, or they're examining like privilege and like whether or not the relatedness to like the students and understanding their journey, I think that matters. And I'm not just talking about like the executive cabinet, but I'm also talking about the board of trustees. Oftentimes the board of trustees has no idea what it means that their college is an HSI. And they're the ones who are, making a lot of decisions around policy and things like that. And so I would say, like, how much time are you spending educating your board of trustees, and who has access to them, and who is giving them information about what it means to be an HSI? And then so if folks are not, thinking about that or willing to do that work, then maybe the HSI is not for you, and making space for people who are willing to do that work for the sake of the students that you serve. Because if you're not going to do that, then there's a place for you, maybe just not at an HSI.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Snap, 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 snaps. It's more like what's not happening at HSIs, but what needs to, right? So thank you for that. And thank you for all this wonderful knowledge that you've shared with us today. I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope our listeners will too.
Thank you. Mil gracias.